What does it truly mean to stand up to authority? When you've been wronged or feel that you've been wronged by the oppressive hand of the government, what options do you have? You could speak out and voice your grievances, but would anyone even listen? Maybe you could gather enough cash to hire a lawyer to fight for your cause, but is it worth it? I don't know. Or maybe you could take matters into your own hands and get creative, or maybe a little bit vindictive. This was the case for one man who stood up against his village's unjust laws, at least to him, challenging their limits on individual property rights in a very unconventional way. Today, we discuss Hank Robar, Potsdam, New York resident, known to some as the Toilet Tyrant, a man who refused to back down from his right to properly maintain his own commode, or commodes. One might say, that's a lot of pots, damn. Welcome to Capers and Cocktails, a true crime podcast that doesn't take itself too seriously and gives you something to enjoy while you listen. The following content may be disturbing to some. Discretion is advised. If you're enjoying one of our themed cocktails, ensure you're of legal drinking age and have fun, but drink responsibly. Capers and Cocktails is going straight down the toilet today. But before we begin, don't forget to smash that share button and share this episode with a friend. Maybe a friend that likes toilets or individual property rights or New York. Potsdam. It's a village in upstate New York that is home to around 15,000 people. If you visit Potsdam, you might see a slew of historical buildings constructed with Potsdam sandstone, a unique red sandstone that was mined in the area during the 1800s. This stone gives the town its charming architectural style. Residents often call themselves the Sandstoners, so that's what we're going to do. The Raquette River runs through the town, adding to its already beautiful surroundings and offering fun activities like kayaking, fishing, and hiking. There are also two colleges in Potsdam, SUNY Potsdam and Clarkson University, and residents are proud to call Potsdam a college town. Apparently, the milk bottle was invented in Potsdam too. Perhaps the Sandstoners would prefer to be known for those things, and not the fact that they are also the home of one man, Hank, once known as Frank Robar. Frederick J. Robar Sr. was born and raised in Potsdam, New York, and has lived there his entire life. When he was working on the farm of a friend of the family at age 13, he was a milk fan. Yeah, the white stuff. Yeah, he was a big fan of milk. He drank a lot of milk, evidently. His buddy told him he was going to tie a cow to Frank and put a crank on it so he could drink as much milk as he wanted, and he started calling him Hank the Crank. The name stuck, and he's been going by Hank ever since. So Hank it shall be. According to Hank, he came from a big family and never had very much, so worked for everything he got. I don't think anyone would ever accuse Hank of not being a hard worker. He sold newspapers at the age of 9. He worked in a flower shop at 14. He and his dad started a gas station in 1960. Today, Hank is in his early 80s. He owns some property and he rents out 16 units and works as a landlord and property manager. Hank has 3 miniature poodles, and he is a poodle guy if you look at the art in his house. This is coming from someone that is a Chihuahua gal, so you got it. He's also got at least 1 cat, so he's an animal lover for sure. In the late 1970s, Potsdam, New York was in dire need of a facelift. Its main street was full of bars and car lots. Buildings were crumbling and storefronts sat vacant. In an effort to revitalize the downtown area, Potsdam joined many other small towns across the U.S. in participating in federally funded urban renewal programs. Bulldozers rolled in, old buildings were torn down, and new modern structures began to take their place. The town's infrastructure was updated and revamped, as were its aging and underutilized areas. As part of this, the city put in tax incentives and tax breaks to, make sure these nice businesses would want to set up shop in downtown revitalized Potsdam. By the time Hank started thinking about toilets, 70% of the village was tax-free property. The average Sandstoner taxpayer individual was, of course, footing the bill for this. According to Hank, in 2004, Dunkin' Donuts came a-knockin' on his door. Well, on some of his property. They were interested in buying some of his hard-earned land, a nice corner lot, to turn their land dough into donuts. Oh, that was bad. Anyway, Dunkin' was willing to pony up $650,000 to Hank. But when Duncan approached the village planning board chairman with his proposal to rezone Hank's land, that guy couldn't have turned him down faster if he'd offered decaf at a cops convention. Hank went in front of the zoning board himself 3 separate times to try and get the zoning changed, and each time he was refused, maybe because they wanted his individual tax dollars. I don't know. According to the zoning board, it was not a good intersection for business, and community members, many who came to their first zoning board meetings ever, also didn't want the land rezoned. But here's the thing. That land is actually surrounded, just on the other side of the streets, by commercial property. Across one street is a Chinese food restaurant, and Five Guys is catty corner to the lot. Duncan just gave up on Hank's land and moved up the street 3 blocks and bought somebody else's land for their donuts. Even worse, the land they eventually bought was a manufactured home park, and something like 20 families were displaced for sprinkles and a cup of joe. Just a bit later, a Taco Bell in Potsdam made it through the exact same rezoning process that Hank had been rejected for. KFC wanted some land rezoned 1,500 feet from Hank's property, and they managed to get it done. Turns out in both of these cases, those pieces of land were owned by someone in the inner circle, if you know what I mean. And then it happened to Hank again. Kinney Pharmacy wanted to buy another one of Hank's properties, and he was rejected yet again. That pharmacy ended up building literally across the street from Hank's property. And Hank got mad, big mad, real mad. But Hank decided somehow, with a spark of genius, to not stay mad, but actually really to get even. But he didn't start with toilets. He started with corn. He plowed the land on one of his properties and planted rows and rows of corn. He made his own farm. And it isn't a farm without a scarecrow, so he, of course, added that. Then he added a row of sunflowers to the back of his corn. And, of course, what do you need to fertilize crops? Fertilizer. Hank would tell a local reporter, quote, "They could have had a Dunkin' Donuts here. Dunkin' Donuts would have looked good here. Instead of smelling Dunkin' Donuts, they're smelling shit." End quote. And then he painted one of his garages to look like a patchwork quilt with, in the words of one reporter, quote, "the most obnoxiously clashing colors that exist," end quote. He once displayed ladies' undergarments on a clothesline outside of his house. And then came commodes. It started with 5. He put them out on his front lawn, and then he got a phone call from the mayor of Potsdam, the head of the village, asking him personally to take them down. Hank evidently told him what he could flush instead. And then he started adding more and more. Eventually, toilets would adorn every one of Hank's 6 properties. He added them to the lawns of all of his rental properties, and he says his tenants like them, and he has no problem renting out the units. It started with just the toilets, but then the man really started decorating them. He put out seasonal decorations for Easter and Christmas, and even now he can be seen carefully picking out flowers from the local Dollar Tree to adorn both the top and the bowls of his toilets. He would say, quote, "You're in a small village, and you got to stick to your belief, and I believe I wasn't hurting nobody. I try to keep them looking good," end quote. He says he spends $500 to $600 a year growing and cultivating his toilet gardens. And speaking of toilets, the cocktail and mocktail for this week are the toilet water. Yeah, it's a real thing thanks to the Cravings of a Lunatic blog. And even though we're not making the cocktails on video these days, I just gotta say this drink looks actually, it doesn't look like toilet water in any toilet I've ever sat on, but it's blue. Head to the description box or Thirsty Thursdays on @KeepersandCocktails for more on the drink. Spell that "and" out, people. Oh, and follow all the, you know what to do. Community opinion on Hank's art project /FU has always been mixed. The toilets have their fans and they have their foes. Some say they support Hank because they also don't want to be told what to do by the government or anyone else. Someone on the NCPR Facebook page said, quote, "LOL, I like it. People need to loosen up a little. Flush the negative down the drain. Find some humor in this, please," end quote. Some others think it's hilarious. Some of his fellow Potsdamians, Sandstoners, donate toilets to him, and there are a few Potsdam toilet-themed t-shirts on the market. On the other hand, in the words of one community member, quote, "As much as he's a jerk, you gotta feel sorry for him. He embarrasses himself and doesn't even realize it," end quote. There have been quite a few letters to the editor that don't exactly support the toilet protest, but Hank doesn't seem to pay much attention to people like those Sandstoners. Some people have been known to also, use the toilets for their intended use, especially after a night out at the local bar. And listen, Hank doesn't just have toilets. He's got bathtubs, including the bathtub from his late grandmother's house. He's got urinals. What can I say? The man loves porcelain. His newer toilet gardens have the toilets attached with steel cables to tall cedar poles to deter vandals. He says that he's had 50 to 75 destroyed throughout the years. And since the very beginnings of his unhinged art as protest installations, the headlines have not stopped coming. Some of them are just too good not to mention. Potsdam's Game of Thrones. Potsdam's toil over toilet trouble. Toilet garden owner asserts village won't unseat his artistry. A flustrated community. Village threatens to flush Robar toilet lot again. Lo and behold, a First Amendment toilet. Listen, I could go on all day here, but I guess I'll spare you. The village wasn't exactly just going to sit back and let this continue. You know that, right? They started looking line by line to figure out exactly which code that they could say Hank was violating so they could get him to remove his toilet parties. They went after him for having bulky waste out, for having dangerous items on the lawn, and so on and so on and so on. Those cases just kept getting dismissed. In 2018, the village gave it one more shot to dethrone Hank. The Board of Trustees passed a law against visible junk. Quote, the deposit, accumulation, display, and/or outdoor storage of junk appliances, junk furniture, junk mobile homes, junk motor vehicles, garbage, regardless of quantity, is hereby prohibited within sight of neighboring properties and/or business concerns, end quote. I should mention that other people who had things on their lawns that were, according to that law I just read, illegal were not cited. But Hank sure was. So at this point, almost 15 years later, Hank decided he had no choice but to, sue. The village of Potsdam was infringing on his First Amendment rights. He would tell a reporter, quote, you've got some people. They've got a little authority in a village and they always think they can push it a little further. But I think now people realize that they do have rights. You just got to stick up for them, end quote. Hank's lawyers claimed that the junk law was a form of revenge against Hank's creative and political expression. They cited lots of evidence that these toilets were, in fact, art. Dr. Stephen Pedersen from Clarkson University asserted, quote, I saw it as a form of little rupture, a little way of kind of sending a ripple through a community. And to me, some art does that. It's sending kind of a little ripple through our understanding of who we are and our sense of identity, end quote. Hank sued the village of Potsdam in federal court in 2021 for $7 million. Although the town revoked the junk statute in February 2021, the lawsuit continued to move forward. In April of 2021, the village settled with Hank. After 17 years, the fight was over. Hank and his lawyers released a statement saying, quote, we believe the artists and citizens of our great nation will someday look to Robar v. Village of Potsdam to be assured that their artistic expression and First Amendment rights cannot be arbitrarily destroyed by an unwarranted local government vendetta, end quote. Hank is certainly not the first to create a large installation out of something that some might not exactly consider art. The Cadillac Ranch in Texas is another iconic installation where visitors are encouraged to spray paint the 10 Cadillacs buried nose down in a field. It's a statement about consumerism, creativity, and public art, and it's been a destination for decades. The Garden of 1,000 Buddhas in Montana is another whimsical installation featuring thousands of Buddha statues placed across a field. Hank's not even the only toilet artist. In 2015, botanical artist Toni Atkinson was fined $10,000 for her lawn toilet art. She would say, quote, this is my version of art. Just because you can't appreciate it doesn't make it not art, end quote. She also turned her toilets into planters, just like Hank, and she had no intention of ever removing her masterpieces. Oh, and I should say this is not even a new thing. Dada art is an avant-garde movement that began in the early 20th century, around 1916. Dada artists didn't care about making pretty or normal art. They wanted to challenge everything people thought they knew about creativity. They used things like collage, weird combinations of images, and even everyday objects. The most famous is probably Marcel Duchamp's famous fountain. It was a urinal he signed with R. Mutt. They were shaking things up. The whole point was to mess with expectations and make people think about art, culture, and society in a different way. It's kind of like the art world's version of a big rebellious why not or an FU. Sound familiar? So is it a toilet or is it art? Well, if it's one of Hank's tanks, it's probably both, depending on who's looking. And is Hank an artist, or did he have art thrust upon him? Either way, he's got a whole lot of porcelain personality. Thanks for hanging out with me. Since this is my podcast, I get to say my opinion. And my opinion is, Hank, go for it. Here's the thing. Hank isn't just some unhinged guy with a passion for porcelain. He's a symbol of the underdog, the guy who keeps fighting even when everyone says, just flush it. And if you don't believe that, maybe you'll agree with the words of a sandstoner. Quote, leave him alone. He ain't bothering nobody. End quote. Maybe the village planning board should have let him turn the land commercial, build that Dunkin' Donuts, and stop being so, I'd say, immoral at the least, and then they never would have had this problem to begin with. I mean, corruption? Probably. If you want to dig a little deeper into the story of Hank and his toilets, there's a whole documentary on Amazon Video that you can watch and hear from the toilet tyrant himself. It's called Potty Town. The director grew up with the toilets basically in his backyard, and it was the major source behind this episode. I gotta say, it made me even more of a fan of Hank than before I watched it. He's humble and charming, and I'd like to hang out with him and share a toilet water cocktail. Next week, a caper about counterfeit wine. You heard me right. I'm gonna need some cheese from this episode. Oh, yikes. Okay, I'll see you next week. And remember, there are always alternatives to preventing a man from making his fortune and forcing him to protest with dozens of toilets.